My name is TJ Henricks, and I welcome you to the 11th Annual Hoosier Distinguished Lecture, hosted by the East Asia Program and co-sponsored by the Departments of History and of Asian Studies. The organizing work of the East Asia Program staff, especially Wei-Ming Xie, Sydney Lin, Amala Lane, who has moved on, and Tianran Song, made this event possible. As always, my co-organizer, Professor Suyong Song of the Asian Studies Department, played a mean passing game. The invitation of today's speaker, Professor Patricia Buckley Ebrey, was the inspiration of our graduate students. Please raise your hands. Who also assisted with logistical support. Before further introductions, I share our land acknowledgement. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayokono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayokono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayokono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayokono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. Patricia Buckley Ebrey, Professor of History Emerita of the University of Washington, is most widely known, well beyond college campuses, for her contributions to the teaching of Chinese history. Until the 1980s, the collections of translated primary sources available to college courses foregrounded intellectual and political history. Professor Ebrey's 1981 Chinese Civilization and Society, a source book, issued in an expanded and revised edition in 1993, broke ground by making available selections that allowed the teaching of social, economic, and gender history. Her Chinese Civilization and Illustrated History similarly helped decenter states and male literati elites. The book grounded Chinese history in the lives of everyday people and in what we now call material culture. Lavishly illustrated in color, it quickly joined her source book as a mainstay of college courses. Not long afterwards, at a time when many China historians were still struggling to figure out email, Professor Ebrey launched her online visual source book of Chinese civilization, something I still send my students to today. And just to round this out, she was enlisted in the production of textbooks on East Asian and world history. Professor Ebrey's contributions to Chinese history teaching are at one with her prodigious scholarship. Her intellectual trajectory began with the social history of ruling elites and came to focus more generally on histories of families, or more particularly on histories of families and social reproduction. Her 1993, The Inner Quarters, Marriage and the Lives of Chinese Women in the Song Period, helped to pioneer Chinese women's history in the US. And my graduate student shared a new edition. So how many times? 5? So it's so the Chinese version, and the original version was what, 2004, and the Chinese version has been reprinted 5 times. So. In more recent work, she co-edited a volume and authored 2 monographs on my favorite Song Emperor, Huizong. In all, I count more than 70 independent articles, 9 monographs, and 8 major edited volumes. Her Cornell Classical Chinese Colloquium presentation tomorrow afternoon, 3:30 in 374 Rockefeller, will feature a selection from her recent co-edited Chinese Funerary Biographies, an anthology of remembered lives. Oh, more recent? Oh my God, what is it? Chinese Chinese autobiographical writings. I actually have this on my shelf and just blanked. Professor Ebrey's many accolades include the 2014 American Historical Association Award for Scholarly Distinction and the 2020 Association for Asian Studies Award for Distinguished Contributions to Asian Studies. The Shih Distinguished Lecture was created by the East Asia Program in honor of one of Cornell's most famous alumni, Shih. Shih was one of the founders of the modern academic study of Chinese history and language globally, the theme of Patricia Ebrey's most recent research and today's talk. Please join me in welcoming Professor Patricia Buckley Ebrey.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Can I make this a little quieter?
I got it.
You got it? Okay. I promised TJ that there would be a couple of resonance to Shih, which you will soon see. So, why is this not moving? Hitting the down button is not doing anything. Okay. So I'm doing a book on China studies in the US, 1920 to 2020. And here I'll give a little advertisement to the Journal for Chinese History. So I was editor of that for 7 years. And one of our last special issues was on traditions of Sinology. Josh Fogel edited it. And he did practically every country in Europe and did Japan and Korea and Vietnam, but not the United States. I thought, well, the United States has played a fairly big role in this too. And for the UK, France, and Germany, there were already whole books. So it seemed that the US story is different than that of any of the European countries and is worth looking at. So the larger book, I see many intersecting trajectories. You could have written it topically, but I'm thinking of doing it chronologically. Clearly, US-China relations is a big part of the story altogether, continuing into today. There's also a kind of interaction between native speakers and language learners. There's journals, scholarly associations, what presses will publish work in the field. There's this institutional side. Certainly, I'm really looking at the academic study. I'm not dealing with the State Department or things like this. So the expansion of higher education in the US, which increased employment opportunities, changes in standards. You go back to 1920, you didn't have to have a PhD to teach in college. As you get into the 50s, 60s, 70s, tenure standards go up, more people get denied tenure, things of this sort. There is a higher education institutional element. Certainly there's intellectual change. You get the growth of the social sciences. They're not that developed in 1920. That's something that largely happens in this century. And then there's fields like religious studies grows a lot. Women's studies is not much before at least the 60s. Theory, global studies, you can point to a lot of intellectual changes. There's social change that affects academic careers, and a lot of this is, let's say, women also joining academia and issues of couples and how you handle going abroad and things like that. Funding is a big thing, whether it's government funding or foundation funding, and that tends to come and go. Sometimes it was only available for national defense. We get NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities. They had a big program on translation. People did translation because there was money. Funding is very important for exhibitions, so it has a big role in art history and so on. And then I'm sure, as all of you know, there's been huge changes in technology, especially the last 20, 25 years. We're no longer in that period like when I started, where the way you took notes was on note cards. OK, so sources I'm using. There's a lot of memoirs, and these are just the ones that had nice covers. So here I'm showing ones that are by non-Chinese. I especially recommend China Bound is actually a pretty well-written book by Fairbank. But I'm showing there Wilbur and Scalapino and Murphy and Botta and Biggerstaff and George Taylor and Frederick Mote. And you can see Baum and Terrell are more recent ones. They're a bit younger than the first group. Many of these are quite interesting to read. A lot of Chinese have written memoirs as well. And again, I'm showing ones that I had covers that you had pictures on rather than library ones that didn't really have pictures. The first one is Ray Huang, Hubing Di, Theodore Chun, Leo Li, T.K. Tong, Yu Ying Shi has already been translated into English, Huang Xiaogung, Xu Joyun, and then some of you may not recognize, Chen was the librarian at Chicago for a long time and very big in training people in library science. Then there's been quite a few studies that are relevant to this project. A fairly recent one is Fabio Lanza on the Committee on Concerned Asian Scholars. So that's anti-Vietnam War generation. Evans on Fairbank and his influence on the field is actually quite interesting book. On the upper right there is a book by Vivian Ling, where she got a lot of people to talk about either their experience learning Chinese or teaching Chinese. Again, they're short little pieces. It's very easy, enjoyable reading. Below it, Jason Guo interviewed 7 art historians. And again, those are interesting things to read. My First Trip to China is, again, an easy read. And then there's some websites that are interesting. And I'm just showing you the one from the University of Hawaii. Sometime you're sitting around saying, I'm going to fool around on my computer. I encourage you to take a look. So here's a quiz. Who do you recognize? Who can recognize somebody? Nobody? OK. John DeFrancis. Above him? No one? Kenneth Chun. Wing Chan. That's not a young Angular person. Sung Yu Ho Aki. So they were all at Hawaii. And I forgot to mention one of the people with really interesting autobiography, and his wife wrote one too, Yuanran Chun, Zhao Yuanran. The second one in there. Several of them, Chun, Zhao, Wing Chan, were there between 37 and 39, trying to get out of China during the war before any place in the US was offering a place. But Hawaii still takes pride, and they're there, even if they were there just a couple of years. DeFrancis was there a long time. OK. So one way I've been thinking about this is in terms of generations. It captures something. It doesn't necessarily capture everything. And so I just took 2 universities that I know more about. So I've been at University of Washington since '97, and I was a graduate student at Columbia. If you go back to the 20s and 30s, a lot of people had either missionary background or at least grew up in China. Maybe they were consular or some other reason to be there. So like L. Carrington Goodrich and Wilbur at Columbia. There was a guy named Gowan at Washington. Then there's the Germans, a lot who left Germany under Nazis. Some were Jewish, many were more leftist, like Wittfogel. And Wittfogel was actually both at Washington and at Columbia. But Washington took quite a few. So they also had Helmut Wilhelm and Franz Michael. Then there's what I call the World War II generation. This I think of as my teachers, people who were, you had both people like Fairbank, who had already been in China in the 30s, already had PhDs, already had jobs, but they're pulled into the war effort, very often in some kind of intelligence. It was called OSS in those days. But then there's those that they trained in Chinese and Japanese. Something like 9,000 soldiers were trained in Japanese, probably under 1,000 in Chinese, but somewhere important in our field. The ones I list there, DeBarry had already started Chinese. They taught him Japanese in the military. Fried was taught Chinese. Doak Barnett already had connections, but he's pulled into the war effort. George Taylor had already been living in China, teaching, but is pulled into the war effort. Then one of the groups I'm going to talk about today are Chinese who left China before 1950. And you can see at Columbia, there were several different kinds of people. C.C. Wang, this C.C. Wang, never finished his PhD, began teaching Chinese, and did a lot of translating. Fang Jiaoying never became a professor, never got a PhD, but a very important researcher. He was a major contributor to the Eminent Chinese of the Qing period, the Ming Biographical Dictionary. So he's someone who stayed a research assistant his full career. And C.T. Shah was one of the people who came in the late 40s, gets a PhD in literature that's not Chinese at Yale, and has to retrain, and that takes 5 or 6 years of doing research assistant type work, often military type stuff, before he can reestablish himself as an expert on Chinese literature. At the University of Washington, Xiao Guangchuan is one of the people who had come over in the 20s and comes back. Vincent Shih comes in the 40s. Li Fengwei also came in the 20s and comes back. There's people who didn't want to live in the PRC. There's a big rush, 48 to 50 or so. Some people who thought maybe their connections to the KMT were too dangerous, tried to move to the US. Then a next generation I see, some more a decade worth, are what I'm calling the baby bust and the job explosion. That is, those of you who know enough American history, but this is true in many other countries, during the Depression, the birth rate goes way down. So there weren't that many people born from 35 to 45. And then 46 and on, we get the baby boom when the soldiers come home and start having babies. So there's and I was born in 47, so always my class as I went through school was like 50% bigger than the class before. So if you were born between 33 or 46 or something like this, and then you're ready for a job in the 50s and 60s, it was really easy to get a job. They were often poaching each other. Someone would be hired, and 3 years later, another school is trying to get them. And their first job, they didn't have to have finished their PhD. Then there's the Vietnam War generation. They are the baby boomers who do their education in the 60s and 70s. And I list some of the people there. You'd probably know many of these names. We're getting to somewhat more contemporary people. You don't see women on the faculty of either of these schools in China studies until we get a little later. So Columbia, Madeline Zellen's probably the first. both Dorothy Ko and Junfang Yu, it's not their first job. They're brought in later. University of Washington, we take some pride that we're the first one to hire Liz Perry. Of course, she gets hired by other places afterwards. Ann Yu is a linguist. Susan Whiting is a somewhat younger scholar. And we've got other women on the faculty too today. And then I would say the PRC generation. That again, you can see both places have quite a few people. And by PRC, I mean the people who were born and raised in the PRC who did their at least graduate education abroad and mostly in the US. Okay, so that's sort of my bigger project. And now what I wanted to focus on today is the issue of China scholars, scholars from China who at least eventually become professors in the field of China studies. And the first one I list there, Zhao Yuanren, he was a classmate of Hu Shi, and they became good friends. So there's another link to Hu Shi. As you can see by my yellow highlighting, most of them did not write on China. They are almost all Boxer Indemnity scholars. They were committed to going back to China. Went back to China, they got great jobs. These were the people with the modern educations. So they were studying something that would be useful to China and going back. The first several, maybe the first 5, are definitely literati families. So you're talking about people who are coming from families that were highly educated. Often their father and grandfather were officials. They had tutors. They memorized the classics in their childhood. But there's a good chance, because they did get into Boxer Indemnity, that they went to a Christian high school anyway. So they were introduced to more math and science and taught English. That really helped to get through the Boxer Indemnity. I'll just say a tiny bit on Wing Zichan, because he's the exception. The only one, I tried to see, in one place I have a survey done in 1928 of instruction on China in the whole country. There were 475 universities, I think. Most places, I think only like 8 places taught Chinese. Even places like Harvard and Columbia had maybe 3 people taking first-year Chinese. But at Berkeley, they had 3 people taking Chinese for Westerners and 102 taking Chinese for Orientals. So already there were Chinese Americans at Berkeley, but they do not become the China scholars. It's the ones from China who had had a traditional education and come over for PhDs who end up later on becoming professors. And those Chinese Americans, you know, they hadn't memorized all the classics as children. Okay, but Wing Zichan is different, totally different from Guangdong in a small town that didn't speak Cantonese. And his grandfather was a barber. His father goes looking for work, goes to Canton, goes to Hong Kong, and eventually the US, doing what people often did at that point for someone with no money and no education. He'd only had 2 years of school. He works in a laundromat. He works in a restaurant. But Wing Zichan is sent to Christian schools. He does become a Christian, I think, and wants to marry this woman who gets into a musical academy in Boston. So he gets his father and his uncle to help him with a tiny bit of money. He gets to Boston. He knocks on the door of the dean. The dean has a conversation with him. This is like 1920, and admits him. But he's working the whole time at restaurants to support himself and has to take 1 year off, completely working at restaurants to support. He actually does a degree on a China topic. He said that at that time at Harvard, because he has a great oral history, he, looking at what they had very spotty books, but they did have the Daozang. And the Daozang had 4 commentaries on the Zhuangzi. So he said, okay, there's enough here, I can do something. But his committee didn't know anything about it. Okay, maybe I should move on to. So then this is the second group, and I'd say these are 2 rather distinct groups of people who become senior scholars in the US. And these are the people who came after 37, especially after 45. A few people are given a chance to come during the war. The US, does have offices in Chongqing during the war. There's some connections. They help a few people come, but after 45, a lot come. And so I've listed some here. Many of you will recognize all these names. Here you get more of them ending up doing China if they realized after 49 they hadn't finished, they still had time. If you wanted a job in the US, you had a much better chance if you picked a China topic. But a couple of major ones like Zodong and Habingdi had not done China topics. So it certainly varies by period. And if you take the case of art history, it's not an average case because there are connections to museums and collecting. So there's jobs outside of academia. And there's quite a few cases of people who go from a museum job to a university job and sometimes back and forth. But originally, the museums, if you were, say, like an early museum was the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, they'd have one person doing all of Asia. And he, was named Wagner, didn't know any of the Asian languages. A lot of the collections were ceramics. It's not a topic the Chinese had written much on. It was sort of done by looking at things. But there were relatively few places you could do PhDs in Chinese art history. In the 1920s to 50s, it was dominated by German art historians. Because basically people think it's in Germany that scholarly art history started. And quite a few of them come over. Bachover was at Chicago. Salmony was first in Mills College in California and then at the Institute of Fine Arts in New York City, NYU. Maxler was first at Michigan and then at Harvard. Those were the early ones. But if you move up to the 60s, there's basically 4 places you could do art history. James Cahill was at Berkeley. He would have been a World War II person. Wen Fang at Princeton. He's someone who comes in after the war. Richard Edwards at Michigan. He was a World War II person too. And Maxler then is at Harvard. Move into a little later, the 70s and 80s, you also get Barnhart at Yale, Marty Powers at Michigan, Bob Bagley joins Wen Fang at Princeton. The 90s, you get Wu Hong at Harvard, and then he moves to Chicago. And then as we get into the 2000s, 2010s, and this is a topic will come up a little later, you can see there's many cases of where you'd had, let's say, a non-Chinese, they're not all men, who is then replaced by Chinese. So Silbergeld is replaced by Wang Chenghua at Princeton. Harris is replaced by Jin Xu at Columbia. Wu Hong to Eugene Wang at Harvard, they're both Chinese. But Pat Berger to Jun Hu at Berkeley. So the majority have been, and you could point to many other cases in other fields, that would have been a fairly recent change since 2000. Okay, but a much bigger field than art history is actually modern history. It's almost always, it was the first appointment a university would make. The first thing they'd probably do is modern history. Almost everyone would say the really big guy in the field is John K. Fairbank. He is a case where if you looked at the trajectory of non-Chinese scholars, very often they don't start, like in his case, till graduate school. He had a hard time that no one was teaching Chinese. He sent off to the UK, and no one was teaching Chinese there either. And so then he spends 3 years in China, where he learns Chinese and meets lots of people, makes lots of friends with. This is an exciting time in Chinese scholarship, so meeting a lot of the leading intellectuals in China too. I recommend you someday look at academictree.org. It shows, as a kind of genealogy, who studied for whom. You can add your own names there. If you think if you're gonna stick with your current advisor, you can put yourself up right now. And so Fairbank shows 44 graduate students. 5 of them have Chinese names: Casey Liu, Deng Siyu, Yitu Zhensun, Xinbao Zhang. They missed Emmanuel Shih and probably others. I do think Harvard put some graduate student on putting this up, because Harvard shows lots of people. But if we asked in terms of the field of modern Chinese history, and here I'm defining that as 19th and 20th century, because Fairbank himself really started 19th century. So Cornell was the place that Xiaogun Chuan did his PhD, and he's back, in the 20s. And a person I'll talk about a little later, Guo Zhenjiao. Columbia had Hubing Di and quite a few other people you'll see listed there. Washington also had Zhang Zhongli, is particularly interesting. Michigan had Zhou Zedong, Ray Huang. He had one of the memoirs. Okay, so then I thought I would take a few of the cases of Chinese scholars. And here there's a Cornell connection. So he's definitely from a literati family. His older brother, Meiichi, had gone to the US, Boxer Indemnity, and returned to teach in Beijing, and rises very high. Mei Bao himself becomes a Christian, goes to the US in 1923, gets an Oberlin BA, a PhD in philosophy, then spends 2 years in Germany. People would often go on to Europe too. And he writes 2 books on Mozi in English. One's a translation, one's a study. So he's, out there in the scholarly world. He has a long, successful career at, one of the really top universities in Beijing in those days, Yenjing University, which is today it's the campus of Beida, but then Beida was downtown. And his brother is at Tsinghua and actually becomes the president at Tsinghua. So you've got these 2 brothers, very high positions. With Pearl Harbor at Yenjing, lots of the universities left in 1937, but Yenjing was considered an American university, sort of, so it was allowed to stay open. But with Pearl Harbor, when US enters the war, they've got to leave too. And he does manage to go west for sort of a consolidated Christian university. He comes to the US in 1949, but he's already 49 years old. It's more than 20 years since he'd lived in the US. He'd been, very high up, so he's able to get a number of visiting positions. Oberlin takes him for a year, Purdue takes him for a year, and then he finally gets a tenure-track job, probably with tenure, 1955. He also does do what can be considered somewhat research assistant type work, and that he translates quite a few documents for de Barry's Sources of the Chinese Tradition. Not just Mozi, does quite a bit of pre-Han thought translations. And I assume that that's helping him during his 5-6 years of just having visiting positions. After retirement in 1970, so he's already 70 years old, he takes visiting positions in Hong Kong and Taiwan, and this is not rare. And his son was on the faculty here for many years, Mei Zulin, who was born in China in 1933 while he's working at Yenching. Okay, so I'll move on to Theodore Chun. And here, the memoir is actually written by his wife. So he was from a Fuzhou Christian family. His parents taught in Christian schools. In 1924, he goes to Columbia's Teachers College, stays 5 years, but hasn't done a PhD, just done a master's. And he teaches in Fujian Christian colleges. He returns in 1937 to finish his PhD, but USC talks him into finishing there instead. They said, we'll take credit for everything you've done at Teachers College. And the dean there says, no, if you would just switch to education in China rather than education in general, we could hire you. So that was a case where, okay, if you switch to China studies, there's a job for you. He does go back to China, though, in 1947. He becomes acting president of Fuzhou Christian University, but he doesn't stay long. And one thing I found quite interesting in the memoir is his wife's perspective. So she, of course, was also Christian. They had tried to do a semi-modern education marriage. That is, it's arranged by the parents, but they were going to sort of like date for a few months first to actually know each other. But she writes about this decision, should we move to the US? Anyone here have a thought on what might be a big issue? Moving to the US in 1949? In China, if you were a university professor, you had an amma for your children. You had a cook, and you had another servant. So you were going to give up all of that to move to the US. So, you know, life is complicated. There's more than one thing going on. Then in 1950, he gets a letter saying that we will offer you at least $200,000 if you can put together a group of Chinese who have done graduate work in the US, who could translate and digest what's coming out of the Chinese press, so we can see what's succeeding and what's failing in the mainland, where are there vulnerabilities and things of this sort. And he shows it to its dean. This is, you know, you have to realize 1950, academic salaries are maybe $2,000, $2,500. So this is a lot of money. They decide we can't turn down so much money. He immediately starts writing all over the country. He hires 12 people, Chinese, who they were what we would probably think of as second or third tier. You know, there may be Iowa State PhD, Washington State PhD, but they all go down to LA. They work together. They discuss the text together. A military base in Alabama eventually publishes, I forget, 14 maybe, reports they made, all of them generally under about 100 pages. They're still available, and they all have this statement of the contract from the Intelligence Research Branch of the Air Force Personnel and Training Research Center. So this is not explicitly CIA money, but it's intelligence money, military intelligence. He remains committed Christian and tries to set up Donghai University in Taiwan as a kind of the Fuzhou Christian college replacement. Very active in Los Angeles Chinese students in the 50s and on. And I think this happens elsewhere as well. Okay, so a more famous scholar to many people would be Dong Zhou, or Zhou Dong. A little bit younger. He gets a BA in Kunming and is able to go to Chicago right away. So he's one of these people who is favored of being able to move to the US during the war. He finishes his PhD in 51, and he has a terrible time trying to get a job. He gets a part-time one-course evening at Illinois Institute of Technology. Then his wife gets a job in the University of Utah. He can only teach a night course. It turns out to be very difficult. Then he gets visa trouble. He's accused of being a communist, and 17 of his professors had to write affidavits saying, he's theoretically interested, but he's not a communist. Then he had worked with this very famous guy, Hans Morgenthau, and he said, if you would just switch into China topic, maybe you could get a job. And he agrees, moves back to Chicago, is put on these grants. And then with his book, I don't know whether people still know this, it's called America's Failure in China. It's in press. He gets a job at the University of Chicago. So he gets a very good job in the end, but 8 years after finishing his PhD and not having much in the way of decent employment. He trains a lot of graduate students. And there's a quite nice article I'm recommending here. I think it's in something like the History of Education or whatever, about his career. So these things like the 17 affidavits to say he's not a communist, I'm pulling from, I think it's a Her article. Okay, then this is a person I've always heard referred to as T.K. Tong. Again, a little bit younger. In 37, his high school moves from Anhui to Chongqing. He does college there as well. He comes in 48 when a lot of people are coming to the US and does diplomatic history at Columbia. In the mid-50s, he works as a research assistant on a lot of projects. Wittvogel's Chinese History Project, he works with that. Borman, who is a retired diplomat, does the Dictionary of Republican Biography. He works for him for several years. He takes a job at the Columbia Library. When I started as a graduate student there in 1968, he was the Chinese librarian. He then finally gets a long-term job at City College. But he finds his passion in oral history of Chinese who are living in New York. The really big one is Hu Shi. He interviews him for a couple of years, and that comes out in Chinese. He also does one of the general warlord, Li Zhongrun, that actually got translated into English. Okay, and so this is the last of the people I'm going to feature. I don't have a picture of him. So he does a PhD at Cornell. There's no obituaries of him, and you'll see all these other people, there are obituaries. He does a BA and comes to the US in 46. He appears as a research assistant in things from 48 on. As an example of how times have changed, so at Harvard, they publish a documentary history of Chinese communism. It's listed as edited by two people who are still graduate students, Conrad Brandt and Benjamin Schwartz. But if you read the preface, it says, all the Chinese translations were done by Jiao Guojun. So he did the translations, and they don't make him a co-author. The other people did the introductions and the annotations. But he does do a chapter on Chinese agrarian reforms in a pretty major 1951 book. It's actually a special issue of a journal, the Annals of the American Political Science Association, I think. But the other authors are all very well-known people, so that's kind of breakthrough. And in that, it says that he's finishing his Cornell PhD that year, but it actually takes him another 3 years. Another thing that comes in interesting, Huscher discusses this in one of his memoirs, that in 1952, the Far Eastern Association, which is the pre-name for the Association for Asian Studies, it met in Boston, and he interrupted Huscher to say, isn't China stronger today? And Huscher adamantly said, no, no, no. And then he said, well, is it at least more independent? And Huscher said, no, no, no. Now, Huscher is really representing Taiwan, Republic of China in this period, and he's even, I'm not sure if he was already the ambassador, but for many years he was. And that gets written up. Yu Shi also discusses that incident, and he says he knew Jiao Guojun at Harvard. He keeps getting research positions even after his 54 PhD. He publishes books under his own name from 57 on. But he sticks very closely to what the Chinese write. And so it's very positive. So as you get into 58, 59, 60, the reviews, at least some of the reviewers, are skeptical. Like one of them says, all the refugees flowing into Hong Kong, can Chinese agriculture be doing so well? 1958, he takes a visiting position in India. 1960, he visits China and writes about it. He says, oh, agriculture, the output is a bit low, but it's because they're natural disasters, which any of you who know have read that, that's what they said at the time of the Great Leap famines. And after that, he goes to Europe and commits suicide, apparently by walking out into the street to be hit by a car. So that was sort of, not every story is happy. But I thought I would just at least mention a little bit of how gender comes in. For the Chinese foreign students, there are very few women. So a couple of the memoirs mention this. They think maybe 1 in 20 who are coming in 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And so one woman shows up, everybody's trying to date her. Now that first generation of people like Jia Yuanran and Xia Gongchuan, they had all been literati class. They'd all been engaged before they came. Jia Yuanran, they tried really hard to get out of his engagement, cost them a lot of money, but they came. But as you get a little later, they aren't all. Now, in this period, too, there aren't very many women getting PhDs. And those who do are often encouraged to take library jobs. Elizabeth Huff, who was the librarian at Berkeley for 30 years, mentions that in her oral history, how when she finishes at Harvard, and she'd been detained in China during the war in Shandong camp, they just said, oh, here's your choices. You know, you didn't have open advertised jobs in those days. Professors knew where there were openings, and they could just tell you this one's for you. And so they said, okay, here's your choices. You can become a librarian at Columbia or a librarian at Berkeley. Mary Wright, many of you probably know her story, and that's her picture is the one on top. She did have the husband issue, Arthur Wright, and Stanford hired them both, but her as the librarian. Not until Yale, 15 years later or something, she gets a job too. I think there's other parts of the story. You would see US social change as part of this. By the 1960s, birth control comes in. People don't have quite as many children. You know, in the 50s, having 4 or 5 children wasn't that rare. By the 80s, people are marrying later. But I think there are a lot of complications. I see employed spouses as complicating scholars' lives later on. So if you went back to people like Fairbank, where his wife didn't work, or she only wrote that you could do in more than one place, you could go off to China for 3 years. Or later in life, you could go back for a year. But I know a lot of people today who maybe they did field work, working on their dissertation, and they spent 2 or 3 years in older generation Taiwan, later maybe in China. But 20 years later, they don't want to disturb the family by trying to go back for a whole year, and they try to just do a summer or something like that. So social change does affect scholars' lives. And then, as probably many of you know, today, clearly a majority, I think, of almost everyone I've talked to, of graduate students in China studies are from China, mostly from the PRC. And now it seems a real majority women. And if you look at this room, that's probably true. So what are my take-home messages? Okay, there's a lot of different stories. They're not all the same, but I think you can sort of fit them into a larger narrative where you see that there is change over time. Some of it change in the US, some of it change in US-China relations, some of it intellectual change. The 2 generations that I mentioned of China scholars are clearly quite different. That group that came over in the teens, 20s, and into the early 30s, they took top jobs back in China. Sometimes they would go, Wing Tze goes back and they make him dean. You know, this kind of thing. On the other hand, if they came back in 1949 or 50, you know, and they're 50 years old, that's not so easy to make the transition. There is this issue of whether you studied a Western subject or a Chinese subject. And in memoirs, a number of people discuss this issue. For instance, Xiaogung Chuan says he thought that many of the people of his PhDs in the mid-20s, that many of those who went to a school that had no one in China and did a degree on China, it was pure fakery. He didn't think they were very good at all. They would have learned much more by doing a dissertation on a topic their thesis advisor knew something about, and that they would have learned other things. Hubbing-Dee, who did do English economy of land kind of things, he also strongly said that if you really tried to do a dissertation on a Western subject and you learned their methodology, you would be able to then go into China subjects seeing it in a different way. So he was also strongly saying that you did better doing a dissertation on a Western subject. But they they had to then retrain somewhere along the way if they wanted a job in the US. The Cold War is an interesting thing to put in here. This is a largely young crowd, so you may not know much about the anti-war movement of the 1960s, Committee on Concerned Asian Scholars, people who were against the Vietnam War, critical of US policy. But there's a couple of quite long exposés of CIA funding, mostly in the 50s, that a lot of the money Say like at MIT, they had this Center for International Studies. Sometimes it goes through the Ford Foundation and sometimes directly from the CIA. And in the anti-war movement mood of 1968 to 70, this seemed totally outrageous. How did people not know who was funding them? And you're sort of complicit in the policies that they were all against if you had accepted money from them. On the other hand, when I turn and look at how Chinese scholars managed to make it into US academia without that money, which was supported scholars during the 50s, it would have been totally different. That almost all the cases, other than Lin Chenyang and Wen Fang, who both had it really easy and were hired right away where they got PhDs, an awful lot of them are being supported on grants for quite a few years. And a lot of those grants were the US government in particular felt they didn't know nearly enough about what was going on in China and wanted people reading Chinese documents and so on. Later on, a lot of that moves to Hong Kong, but in the mid-50s, a lot of it's being done in the US. So there is a tricky issue of the source of the money may not be the only thing that matters. The consequences of the money are also interesting. And I would argue that those scholars like Zhou Dong and C.T. Shah are part of what make possible the huge expansion in the training of China scholars that starts in the 60s and 70s. So without some of that money that enabled those people to hang through, there wouldn't have been as many people available to get into the big, as the baby boomers start, and there's Ford money, and there's the National Defense Foreign Language thing that throws a lot of money into China studies. I mean, that's a big expansion. But this was not anybody's strategic plan. You know, you always have to remember there's a lot of contingency in history. Clearly, many people have dual identities that survive a long time. After people get tenure, a lot of them switch to primarily writing in Chinese. You know, one of the most famous Chinese scholars of recent times, though he died last year, year before, Yu Shi. You know, once he got tenure, he basically wrote in Chinese. He wrote a huge amount in Chinese, but that's what he preferred to do. A lot of cases I found when I try to reconstruct lives, if they had to, in the period with compulsory retirement and even some after compulsory retirement, they would want to teach in Taiwan or Hong Kong for a few years, at least 3 or 4 years. So a lot of people wanted to go back to a Chinese environment. Then I thought some of you might think, why are we just talking about the 30s, 40s, 50s? What about today? And the thing that's sort of a bit resonance, I see resonances in, are a kind of attack on area studies that came in the 90s, where they said after the breakup of the Soviet Union, we don't need these old Cold War ways of thinking, and that area studies was a Cold War concept. Some of this argument seems to me they're lumping all the different areas together, where China was actually a country. It's not an imperialist designation of what area you should study. So it's a little different than Latin American studies or African studies. But they ended up, for this reason, many people in the social sciences agreed, saying area studies is an antiquated concept. And the SSRC, Social Science Research Council, decides to abolish the joint committees. So we'd had a joint committee on China studies. It had been a joint committee on contemporary China, but then they did one. And they put out to me a really great set of conferences that led to conference volumes that had always insisted that the conferences should not be purely humanist or purely social scientists. At least one person should be outside of it. And as someone in history, I thought these were very valuable. To get historians, say, talking to anthropologists or sociologists really helped the development of social history and cultural history, too, for that matter. And then this a little bit intersects with what I was calling the born in China generation, where the big thing about area studies was, okay, we're going to start with language training, and then we're going to teach them enough about the culture, about the history, so that they could go there. But of course, if you were born in China, you don't need to be taught Chinese. Many people who are going into economics or something would say, you know, I don't need to know what people are doing in Chinese history or literature, certainly. I can just do economics. And so you're getting more of a separation of the social sciences from the humanities. To me, I worry a bit about the impact, at least on historians, where I think interaction with social scientists was very valuable. And I will stop there and welcome questions.